On a freezing night when the wind cut like a blade and hunger sat heavy in his chest, a poor man stirred the last bowl of stew he owned, never imagining this moment would rewrite his destiny. His small home shook as a shadow blocked the doorway, revealing a ragged giant stranger soaked in snow and blood, eyes filled with exhaustion and silent pain. Fear gripped the man's heart, yet something deeper refused to let him turn away. He looked at the thin stew, knowing it was all he had to survive the night, and then looked at the stranger who might not survive till morning, with trembling hands. He offered the bowl, choosing compassion over comfort. The stranger ate slowly, watching the man with unreadable eyes, as if measuring his soul. Outside, the storm roared louder, unaware that a simple act of kindness was about to awaken a force that would shake the land by dawn. The man lived on the edge of the village where broken fences met empty roads and no one noticed his footsteps. He was a humble villager with rough hands and tired eyes, known only for quiet kindness that brought him nothing in return. People passed him daily without a greeting, speaking his name only when they needed help. He worked from dawn to night, mending tools, carrying loads, and fixing what others had broken, yet his own life remained shattered and unseen. He owned little, dreamed less, and expected nothing from the world that had long forgotten him. Still, his heart stayed gentle in a place hardened by survival. In a village where strength earned respect and wealth earned power, he had neither. What he carried instead was compassion, a quality many called weakness. No one imagined that this overlooked man would soon stand at the center of a moment that would silence every voice that had ignored him. The silence of the village grew heavier as night settled fully, wrapping every house in cold shadows and unspoken fear, because strangers were never welcomed here after dark. Doors were bolted early, fires were kept low, and even dogs stayed quiet, as if they sensed something unseen moving beyond the narrow paths. The man returned to his small home after another long day, his body aching but his mind calm, unaware that this night would break the routine that had defined his life. Frost covered the ground like pale ash, and the air carried a sharp stillness that made every sound feel dangerous. He lit a weak fire and warmed his hands, listening to the wind slide through broken wood and dry leaves. Outside, the village stood frozen in place, as though holding its breath, shaped by old stories of travelers who brought trouble instead of peace. People here believed outsiders carried curses, war, or hunger, and fear had taught them to survive by shutting their hearts. The man understood this fear, yet he never fully accepted it because loneliness had taught him a different lesson. As the hours passed, the cold grew stronger, pressing against the walls and creeping into his bones, and the fire slowly faded into glowing embers. Somewhere far beyond the houses, footsteps echoed faintly, heavy and uneven, swallowed quickly by the dark. No one noticed, no light moved, no voice called out because fear kept everyone hidden. The man sat quietly, staring into the dying fire, thinking about nothing and everything at once, when a strange tension filled the air, thick and warning like the moment before a storm breaks. The wind shifted direction, carrying a low breath that did not belong to the night, and the ground seemed to tremble for a brief second. His heart tightened, not with panic but with awareness, as if destiny itself had stepped closer without asking permission. Outside, the cold wrapped the village tighter, sealing it from the world, while unseen eyes moved slowly through the darkness toward his door. He did not know it yet, but the silence, the fear, and the frozen air were not signs of danger meant to destroy him, but signals of a test approaching quietly, one that would reveal who he truly was when the world was not watching. The tension broke suddenly when a deep thud echoed outside the man's home, heavy enough to shake the door and send a sharp chill through his spine, and before fear could settle, another sound followed, slow and uneven like breath fighting to stay alive. He rose cautiously, every step measured, and opened the door just enough for firelight to spill into the night, revealing a massive figure collapsed in the snow only a few steps away. The stranger was enormous, far larger than any man the villager had ever seen, his body wrapped in torn cloth darkened by frozen blood, his chest rising with painful effort. Snow clung to his hair and beard, and wounds marked his arms and side, proof of a battle that had ended badly. The man's heart pounded as instinct warned him to shut the door, yet his feet refused to move back. The stranger tried to speak, but only a weak sound escaped, carrying exhaustion instead of threat. Fear wrestled with compassion inside the man, as the cold wind cut between them, reminding him how close death stood. He knew helping this outsider could invite danger, anger the village, or cost his own life, yet leaving him there meant certain loss. The giant shifted slightly, then collapsed fully, the strength that once held him upright finally gone, and the ground beneath him stained darker against the white frost. The man knelt without thinking, feeling the stranger's skin icy beneath. His fingers, realizing time was slipping away. Around them, the village remained sealed in silence, blind to the moment unfolding at its edge. The stranger's eyes opened briefly, sharp despite pain, carrying a strange depth that unsettled the man more than sighs or wounds ever could. There was no plea, no demand, only a quiet acceptance that fate rested in another's hands. The wind howled softly, urging a choice, while the fire behind the man flickered as if watching. He swallowed hard, understanding that whatever he did next would mark him forever. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath as he stood between. Fear taught by survival and mercy born from the heart. Slowly, with effort, he pulled the stranger closer to shelter, every movement heavy, every second burning into memory. Snow fell thicker, covering footprints, hiding evidence as if nature itself wanted no witness. The door creaked open wider, light spilling across the wounded figure, and in that glow, the man saw not a monster, not an enemy, but a life hanging by a fragile thread. He did not know who this stranger was or why he had come, but he knew one. Truth clearly in that moment, turning away would haunt him longer than any consequence of kindness ever could. Fear tightened around the man's chest as he stood there, the weight of the stranger's presence pressing against every lesson the village had taught him, warning that mercy toward outsiders often ended in regret. His hands shook slightly as he steadied the giant near the doorway, feeling how fragile even great strength becomes when life begins to slip away. Every instinct urged him to step back, close the door, and protect himself from whatever danger this wounded figure carried. Yet his heart pushed harder, refusing to accept safety built on abandonment. He saw the stranger's breath weaken with each moment, heard the faint struggle for air, and knew that hesitation itself could become a silent sentence. Memories of being ignored, of standing alone while others turned away, surfaced without warning, shaping his choice more than fear ever could. The cold bit deeper, numbing his fingers, but it could not numb the warmth rising inside him, a quiet resolve born from years of hardship. He imagined the village reaction if they discovered what he had done, the anger, the blame, the threats whispered behind closed doors. Yet those thoughts felt distant compared to the life depending on him now. The stranger's eyes met his again. No longer sharp, but heavy with trust placed too easily, and that trust cut deeper than any blade. He realized that turning away would not simply end a life outside his door. It would end something within himself that he had guarded through years of neglect. Slowly, carefully, he guided the giant fully inside, closing the door against the night, sealing himself away from fear along with the cold. The firelight revealed the true damage, torn flesh, deep wounds, and exhaustion carved into every line of the stranger's face, yet still there was dignity in how he endured pain without complaint. The man swallowed his doubt, steadying his breath, reminding himself that courage often feels like terror before it feels like strength. He fetched water, cleaned blood from skin, and wrapped cloth around injuries, each motion deliberate, each second heavy with consequence. The stranger winced but remained silent, watching the man with growing awareness, as though realizing this kindness carried a cost. Sweat mixed with frost on the man's brow as fear slowly gave way to purpose, replacing panic with calm determination. In that small room, with the storm raging outside and the village asleep in ignorance, he made peace with the risk he had chosen. He accepted that whatever followed this night would be shaped by this moment, this refusal to let fear decide who he was. As the fire crackled softly, he felt a strange certainty settle within him, not that he would be safe, but that he had done what was right. In the quiet glow, fear still lingered, but it no longer ruled him, because compassion had claimed its place, steady and unyielding, guiding his hands and his heart toward a fate he could not yet imagine. The man turned toward the small pot resting near the fire, its contents barely enough for one meal, and for a moment he hesitated, feeling the quiet weight of hunger that had followed him through many nights before. He lifted the lid, releasing the thin steam of stew made from scraps saved carefully over days, and the smell filled the room with a warmth that promised comfort he knew he would soon lose. His stomach tightened, reminding him that this was all he had until morning. Yet his eyes drifted back to the stranger whose strength had faded into fragile stillness. Without speaking, he poured the stew into a single bowl, the sound soft but final, like a choice being sealed. He carried it closer, knelt beside the giant, and raised the bowl gently, offering it with both hands as if it were something sacred. The stranger looked surprised, his gaze moving from the bowl to the man's face, as though trying to understand why someone with so little would give away the last thing keeping him alive. The man gave a small nod, urging him to eat, even as his own hunger pressed harder against his ribs. The stranger accepted slowly, each movement careful, and took the first spoonful with visible effort, warmth returning faintly to his eyes. The fire crackled quietly, reflecting off the bowl as if bearing witness to a sacrifice unseen by the sleeping village. As the stranger ate, strength returned piece by piece, color slowly replacing the dull shade of pain while the man sat nearby, hands folded, pretending not to notice his own growing emptiness. Every swallow felt like a countdown, marking how little remained, yet he did not interrupt, did not rush, did not regret. He understood hunger, but he also understood that life could not wait. The stranger paused once, offering the bowl back, but the man gently pushed it away, his expression firm, leaving no space for refusal. Silence filled the room again, heavy but calm, broken only by the soft sound of breathing growing steadier with each passing moment. The man leaned back against the wall, feeling weakness creep in as warmth faded from his own body, yet peace settled where fear had once lived. He knew he would lie down hungry, perhaps weaker by dawn, but he also knew he had fed more than a body. He had fed hope into a night ruled by cold. The stranger finished the last drop and lowered the bowl, meeting the man's eyes with a look that carried unspoken meaning, something deep and restrained, as if this simple act had touched an ancient promise. The man took the empty bowl, washed it carefully, and placed it aside, accepting the quiet ache within him as the price of his choice. As the fire burned lower, he wrapped a thin blanket around the stranger, then settled onto the floor himself, listening to the steady rhythm of life beside him. Hunger pressed on him, sharp but honest, yet it could not overpower the quiet certainty growing stronger in his chest. The knowledge that even in a world shaped by fear, one small sacrifice could still hold immense power. The room settled into a fragile calm as the stranger rested against the wall, strength slowly returning while the fire dimmed into a steady glow. And after a long silence he finally spoke, his voice low and measured, carrying weight without revealing detail. He thanked the man quietly, not with emotion but with respect, as if gratitude were something he rarely offered yet never forgot. The man listened without pressing questions, sensing that words forced would break whatever balance had formed between them. The stranger's eyes held stories he chose not to share, shadows of loss and conflict flickering behind each glance toward the door, as though danger were a memory that refused to loosen its grip. When the man asked only whether the pain had eased, the stranger answered simply, nodding once, admitting the warmth and food had pulled him back from the edge. They spoke in short moments, about the cold, about travel, about nothing that carried names or places, and still every pause felt heavy with meaning. The stranger revealed little, yet every word sounded careful, shaped by discipline rather than fear, hinting at a life lived among power and consequence. The man noticed how even while injured, the stranger sat with quiet authority, his posture controlled, his awareness sharp despite exhaustion. At one point, the stranger studied the man closely and asked why he had helped without knowing the cost. The question lingered, filling the space between them, and the man answered honestly, saying he could not watch someone fade when he had the strength to act. The stranger considered this, eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring the truth behind. Such simplicity. He spoke again, softer this time, saying kindness given freely often carried greater weight than strength taken by force. The man did not respond, unsure whether the words were wisdom or warning, but he felt their depth settle into him. Outside, the wind eased, and the night grew quieter, as though listening itself. The stranger shifted, wincing briefly, then steadied, revealing discipline born from long struggle rather than comfort. He mentioned no enemies, no allies, no destination, yet the air around him suggested unfinished paths and responsibilities far beyond this small room. The man sensed that this meeting was not chance, but he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on keeping the fire alive and the stranger steady. Their conversation drifted into silence again, comfortable yet charged, each aware that morning would demand movement and truth. Before resting, the stranger looked directly at the man and said that debts of the heart were not easily forgotten, especially by those who understood honor. The man nodded, unsure what such a statement truly meant, but feeling its promise echo quietly within him. As sleep finally claimed them both, the room held more than two resting bodies. It held an unspoken bond forming in the dark, shaped by restraint, trust, and secrets waiting for daylight to decide their shape. The man woke to a strange stillness that felt different from ordinary morning quiet, the fire reduced to faint embers and the air colder than before. And as his eyes adjusted, he realized the space beside the wall was empty. He sat up quickly, scanning the room, expecting to see the massive form resting where he had left him, but there was only a folded blanket and an untouched corner of shadow. His heart dropped with confusion as he stood and moved toward the door, finding it slightly open, letting in a thin line of pale pre-dawn light. Outside, the snow lay smooth and undisturbed except for a few heavy impressions leading away into the darkness, already softening under frost. The stranger was gone, leaving no sound, no farewell, not even a glance back. The man felt a quiet ache settle in his chest, not anger, not regret, but a hollow uncertainty that made the room feel larger and lonelier than before. He stepped outside, breath fogging the air, listening for movement, but the village remained asleep, unaware that something extraordinary had passed through its edge. For a moment he wondered if the night had been a dream shaped by hunger and cold. Yet the empty bowl by the fire and the blood-stained cloth in his hands told a different truth. He searched the ground again, noticing how the footprints led confidently toward the distant hills, not the steps of a dying man, but of someone restored. That realization stirred mixed emotions, relief that the stranger lived, and doubt about whether his kindness had truly mattered. There was no thanks spoken, no promise given, no reward hinted, only silence left behind like a question without an answer. The man returned inside and closed the door gently, sitting where he had slept, feeling hunger press harder now that warmth was gone. He stared at the fire, replaying every moment, every choice, wondering if he had been used or if this was simply how such encounters ended. Part of him felt foolish for expecting acknowledgement, yet another part understood that some acts were meant to be completed without witnesses. As the sky lightened slowly, he accepted that the stranger owed him nothing, and that the decision to help had never been about gratitude. Still, the absence felt heavy, as though something unfinished lingered in the air. He cleaned the room, carefully erasing signs of the night, knowing the village would ask questions if they noticed anything unusual. When the sun finally crept over the horizon, he prepared to face another ordinary day, believing this story would fade into memory like so many others. Yet as he stepped outside again, he paused, sensing a shift he could not explain, a quiet tension beneath the calm morning. Though the giant had vanished without a word of thanks, the man felt certain that the night had not truly ended, only paused, and that the silence left behind carried meaning far greater than spoken words. As the morning settled fully over the village, doubt crept into the man's thoughts with a quiet persistence that matched his hunger, whispering questions he could not silence. He moved through his routine slowly, each task heavier than usual, wondering whether compassion had blinded him to common sense. The empty pot reminded him of the meal he no longer had, and the faint ache in his body made the sacrifice feel sharper now that the night's urgency had passed. He replayed the stranger's silent departure again and again, searching for meaning where none was given, questioning if his kindness had been misplaced in a world that rarely returned such gestures. Neighbors passed him without noticing the storm inside his mind, speaking of small concerns, unaware that his faith in goodness was being tested more fiercely than his strength. He asked himself if fear might have been wiser, if closing the door would have spared him this emptiness, this quiet feeling of having been left behind once more. The thought stung deeply because it echoed a lifetime of giving without recognition, of standing unnoticed at the edge of other people's lives. He considered the possibility that the stranger had simply taken advantage of his mercy, leaving nothing but footprints and fading warmth. Yet even as doubt pressed, he reminded himself that he had not acted for praise, nor for return, but because he could not ignore suffering placed before him. That truth stood firm even as questions circled. As evening approached, the doubt softened into something more reflective, less sharp, like a wound beginning to close. He realized that, even if his kindness changed nothing beyond that night, it had preserved something within him, a part of his humanity the world had not yet taken. Though uncertainty remained, it no longer felt like regret, but like a quiet pause. Before understanding, he could not know then that his doubts were standing at the edge of revelation, that the choice he questioned would soon return with a weight that would silence every fear he carried. But for now he walked home slowly, carrying both hunger and hope, unaware how close destiny truly was. The next morning began like any other, pale sunlight spilling over the rooftops and glinting off the frost, still clinging to the village paths. But the peace shattered the moment the first distant thrum of hooves and the clatter of metal reached the man's ears, pulling him from routine into immediate alarm. He stepped outside cautiously, heart tightening as a vibration ran through the ground beneath his feet. Subtle at first and then growing stronger, a rhythm that did not belong to wind or ordinary animals. His eyes widened as shapes appeared on the horizon, hundreds of figures moving in unison, armor glinting, banners snapping in the cold breeze, their presence overwhelming in scale and intensity. The village stirred into chaos instantly, doors slamming, children crying, and people scrambling to hide or flee, yet the man remained frozen in place, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with any memory of threat that could be ordinary. The warriors advanced with precision, disciplined and silent in their own ways, their eyes scanning the village as if measuring not homes but hearts. Panic rippled outward, voices rising in terrified confusion, but he stood still, realizing instinctively that this force was different from any marauder or band of thieves the village had feared. His mind raced, connecting the dots from the night before, the stranger, the footprints, the empty path that led toward the hills, and suddenly understanding that the one he had aided so selflessly was at the center of this movement. The ground seemed to quake with the weight of destiny, and he felt small, yet strangely steady, knowing that the events unfolding were tied directly to his choice, a choice made quietly, without expectation, and now returning with unimaginable magnitude. As the warriors drew closer, the man noticed their leader emerge, a figure immense and commanding, familiar from the night of hunger and fear, yet transformed, clad in authority, his gaze sweeping the village and finally resting on the man. Hush fell, the chaos momentarily suspended, as the villagers realized the connection and the power standing silently before them. Questions raced through his mind, wonder mingling with awe as he saw recognition flicker across the leaders. Eyes and acknowledgement unspoken but deep, carrying weight heavier than words could convey. The soldiers knelt methodically, a display of respect and loyalty that stunned the villagers into silence, their numbers and discipline creating an almost surreal scene of honor paid to a simple man who had acted with nothing but a pure heart. Shock froze him, disbelief battling with pride, as he understood that the night of sacrifice had rippled outward, creating a bond that no fear or disbelief could undo. He felt an overwhelming rush of emotion, the cold and hunger forgotten, replaced by awe and gratitude as he realized that the smallest act of kindness had summoned the greatest power, and that his life, once overlooked, was now at the center of something far beyond the ordinary limits of his village, a moment that would be remembered forever, not because of wealth or weapons, but because courage had spoken in silence and been answered in an extraordinary way that no eye had predicted and no heart had imagined. Panic spread through the village like wildfire as the first sight of armored warriors drew closer. Every household erupting into frantic movement, doors banging, animals crying, and children clinging to parents who themselves trembled in fear, believing the end had arrived. The man stood at the edge of the main square, heart hammering in rhythm with the thunder of hundreds of hooves and the metallic clatter that shook the ground beneath him, unsure how to calm the chaos around him while realizing that this moment was the consequence of a choice he had made in silence. Women screamed warnings, men brandished tools and sticks, hoping to protect what little they had, and the narrow streets became a maze of confusion as villagers ran without knowing where safety lay. Every eye searched for explanation, every ear strained to hear orders, yet nothing in the village prepared them for the magnitude of the approaching force. The air grew thick with tension, and dust rose from hurried footsteps, mixing with frost and morning light to create an almost surreal haze that magnified fear. From the front, the leader moved deliberately, massive and commanding, yet his eyes scanned the village not with malice but with recognition, searching for a single person whose actions had silently changed everything. The villagers did not understand, only that the ground trembled, that banners and spears glinted like thunderclouds approaching, and that every instinct screamed danger. Rumors erupted among them instantly, whispered and shouted at once of invaders, revenge, or war, fueling terror and misunderstanding. The man felt a strange calm amidst the storm, recalling the stranger's eyes from the night before, recalling the quiet trust and the act of sharing what little he had, and slowly realized that what approached was not destruction but a reckoning, a force bound to him by gratitude and loyalty rather than threat. Yet the villagers could not see this, and their screams grew louder, their movements more frantic, as if fear itself had taken physical form. Children clung to mothers, elders shouted warnings, and every corner of the village seemed to vibrate with anticipation of disaster. Even the man's body trembled with adrenaline, but his mind raced faster, understanding that silence and patience were now his only weapons against hysteria. The approaching warriors' precision contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding them, a visual testament to discipline and purpose that the villagers could not comprehend, their fear blinding them to the true nature of what was unfolding. He lifted his voice, calling for calm, but the sound was almost drowned by panic and disbelief, yet he refused to step back, stepping instead toward the square, raising his hands to show there was no threat from his side. As the warriors slowed, kneeling one by one in unison behind their leader, the realization began to seep slowly into the village, but not quickly enough to stop the fear that had already been sown. The man watched the trembling faces, the wild eyes, the confusion, and understood that this was the most delicate moment, the balance between terror and understanding, that would decide whether the village witnessed a miracle or a disaster. Every second stretched, charged with emotion, suspense, and uncertainty as the future of the man, the stranger, and the entire village hung suspended in the thin air between fear and revelation, ready to tip toward awe or chaos depending solely on what was revealed next. A hush fell over the village as the massive figure at the front of the warriors stepped forward, no longer ragged and broken but transformed into a powerful leader whose presence demanded attention, commanding awe without a word. The torn cloth of the night before was replaced by polished armor that gleamed in the pale sunlight. A mantle of authority draped across broad shoulders, and a sword hung at his side as if it had always belonged there. His eyes, once tired and wary, now burned with quiet command, scanning the villagers slowly, deliberately, as though measuring their worth while simultaneously acknowledging something deeper in a single person. Every heartbeat in the village seemed to pause, the wind itself holding its breath, as realization began to creep into the minds of those who had panicked only moments before. The man, standing at the edge of the square, felt a surge of disbelief and recognition, his chest tightening as the stranger's gaze landed on him directly, a silent acknowledgement of the night they had shared and the mercy that had saved him. The leader's lips moved, forming words that did not need to be spoken aloud to carry weight, and the soldiers behind him knelt in perfect unison, creating a scene so overwhelming it felt unreal, like watching a vision born from both fear and hope. Villagers froze, some dropping to their knees instinctively, others clasping hands over mouths, eyes wide with shock, struggling to reconcile the giant who had appeared wounded and dependent the night before with the figure now standing, with unshakable authority. The man's mind raced, connecting every moment, every decision, every spoonful of stew he had offered, understanding at last that what he had done in silence had summoned power far beyond anything he could have imagined. The leader's gaze softened for the first time, just enough for recognition to pass between them, and the man felt a warmth that replaced doubt with clarity, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. The soldiers' discipline reinforced the revelation, their helmets catching light, their spears forming a wall of loyalty, not threat, and the village trembled under the weight of a force they had misunderstood until this instant. The leader raised a hand slightly, a gesture that demanded attention without speaking. Fear began to dissolve as understanding took root, hearts slowing, jaws unclenching, and the villagers began to murmur, the sound of awe and disbelief merging into a collective awareness that something miraculous had occurred. The man's eyes never left the leader, understanding that the night of selflessness had created a bond unspoken yet unbreakable, and that this moment was proof that courage and compassion could summon loyalty, honor, and recognition in ways wealth and power alone never could. Every detail, the gleaming armor, the silent soldiers, the calm authority imprinted itself on his mind, leaving no room for doubt, only a deep, humbling understanding that his quiet act had rewritten the story of not just a stranger, but of the village itself, and perhaps of his own life forever. A revelation both terrifying and magnificent, as he finally grasped the true meaning of what had begun with a simple bowl of stew on a freezing night. Time seemed to slow as the leader raised his hand slightly, signaling the soldiers behind him to halt, and one by one, the 100 warriors knelt in perfect unison, their eyes fixed not on the village or their surroundings, but solely on the man, who had offered a single act of mercy the night before, a gesture that now commanded the deepest respect imaginable. The village held its collective breath, unable to comprehend the transformation of fear into awe, and the man himself felt a rush of emotions so intense that it nearly unbalanced him, pride mixing with disbelief, humility intertwining with a warmth that reached into every corner of his chest. Each soldier lowered himself with deliberate reverence, creating a sea of bowed heads and shining armor that reflected both sunlight and the gravity of the moment, and in that instant the man realized that the kindness he had shown in quiet desperation had summoned loyalty more powerful than any army, more binding than wealth or status. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes as he watched, unable to speak, feeling the weight of honor descend upon him like a mantle he had never expected to bear. The villagers, initially frozen in panic, now whispered among themselves, eyes wide with wonder and disbelief as they observed the spectacle of devotion. The leader's calm authority mirrored in every movement behind him. He saw the leader nod subtly, acknowledgement passing silently between them, an unspoken bond forged by compassion rather than obligation. And in that nod was an entire story, struggle, survival, trust, and gratitude condensed into a single, profound gesture. The man remembered the cold, the hunger, the night spent sharing what little he had, and felt an overwhelming affirmation that no sacrifice, however small it seemed at the time, was ever wasted when given with a pure heart. The wind stilled outside, carrying away the echoes of panic, leaving only the rhythm of kneeling warriors, a sound heavier than thunder and yet filled with respect and life. Children peeked from behind doorways, elders straightened in disbelief, and neighbors who had doubted or ignored him now stood witness to the truth. True courage and compassion carried a power that no force could match. He stepped forward slightly, unsure whether to bow in return or simply stand, feeling the weight of their gaze like a tide of honor washing over him, and the leader gestured again, silently allowing him to rise without breaking the respect being paid. The man's heart swelled as emotion overtook him, pride tempered by humility, fear replaced entirely by awe and gratitude, knowing that this moment would echo far beyond the village, teaching everyone present a lesson impossible to forget. He saw the subtle pride in the leader's eyes, the discipline in the soldiers' postures, and realized that the small bowl of stew, offered without expectation, had become the bridge between ordinary life and extraordinary recognition. The villagers' murmurs grew into whispers of hope, some kneeling instinctively themselves, and a quiet understanding spread, that mercy had the power to change destinies, that a single choice could ripple outward to reshape the world, and that the man who had acted with nothing but compassion was now at the center of a moment so magnificent, so profoundly emotional, that no one present would ever forget the day the humble villager became honored by the warriors who owed their lives and loyalty to the kindness of his heart. The man stood at the center of the village square, the morning sun catching the gleam of armor and weapons surrounding him. Yet it was not their strength that made him feel larger than life, but the quiet realization that his small act of kindness had transformed everything he had ever known about himself and the world around him. For years he had lived unseen, a shadow among neighbors, a figure whose presence barely registered. Yet now every eye was upon him with respect, awe, and gratitude, and the weight of that attention pressed on him in a way that was both humbling and exhilarating. The soldiers, disciplined and orderly, remained kneeling, their leader watching with calm authority, and the villagers, once frozen in fear and panic, now stepped back slowly, murmuring among themselves in disbelief, recognizing that the man who had fed a stranger in need had somehow become more powerful than any ruler or warrior they had ever known. Pride mixed with disbelief in his chest, a feeling that was tempered by the memory of the night spent offering the last of his food, and warmth, the sacrifices that had felt so ordinary at the time, now magnified into a force that commanded loyalty, honor, and recognition. He felt his heart expand, understanding that power did not always come from wealth, weapons, or fear, but from courage, compassion, and the willingness to act when others turned away. Children stared at him wide-eyed, neighbors whispered and glanced at each other in awe, and even the animals seemed to sense the change, moving quietly as if respecting the new energy that radiated from his presence. The man moved slowly among the villagers, his steps measured, each one carrying the confidence that comes not from conquest, but from knowing that he had chosen correctly when it mattered most. He looked to the leader, who nodded once, subtly, acknowledging that the bond formed between them was unbreakable, that loyalty given freely in response to kindness was stronger than any command issued by fear. The villagers' eyes followed him, searching for evidence of some trick, some hidden reason, yet finding none, they began to see truth in simplicity, that genuine compassion could command more than intimidation or wealth ever could. He breathed deeply, feeling the sun on his face and the weight of possibility settle within him, understanding that his life, once small and ignored, was now touched by extraordinary consequence. The realization brought tears to his eyes, not for himself, but for the power of humanity itself, that one small act could ripple outward, shaping destinies and creating respect that no words or effort alone could achieve. The soldiers rose slowly, standing behind their leader, but their eyes remained on him, as if waiting for guidance that he had never thought he would give. The villagers, still hesitant but now curious, approached quietly, seeking reassurance, witnessing firsthand that his strength lay not in muscle or status, but in heart and choice. Every step he took reinforced the transformation, the invisible man now a figure whose courage and mercy had rewritten the rules of his world, a living proof that kindness carried power beyond imagination, and that true influence is earned not by command, but by selfless action that touches lives in ways no one can ignore. A lesson that would echo through the village and far beyond for generations to come, as the humble villager who had once been overlooked now stood undeniable, unshakable, and profoundly powerful. That day, the village learned a lesson no one could ever forget. As the humble man who had once been invisible stood at the center of warriors and neighbors alike, his heart still gentle, his spirit unbroken, proving that power without compassion was empty and mercy held more weight than any sword. Eyes that had doubted him now shone with awe, and whispers of disbelief turned into quiet respect, as the realization spread that courage is not measured by size, wealth, or fear, but by the willingness to act when others would turn away. The man's hands, once rough from labor and survival, now carried the invisible strength of kindness, a force that reshaped lives and commanded loyalty without a single command. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, watching the moment when ordinary humanity became extraordinary, and the villagers understood forever that true greatness is born from compassion, not strength, and that a single selfless act can echo far beyond expectation, changing the world in ways no one could imagine.